Squadrons, we make it clear.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Spacepower podcast. I'm your host, Bill Wolf, the founder and CEO of the Space Force Association, and I'm honored today to have with me Major General James Smith, who is the commander, Space Training and Readiness Command, headquartered at Patrick Space Force Base, Florida. As commander, he's responsible for preparing the U.S. Space Force and more than 8,600 Guardians to prevail in competition and conflict through innovation and education. General Smith, thanks so much for being with us today.
Yeah. Hey, Bill, thanks for having me, and thanks for all the Space Force Association does for our Space Force and for our Guardians.
Thank you, sir. It's our pleasure. We are definitely here for you. And sir, for those who don't know, can you walk through STARCOM's mission? And really what I want to understand is you've been in the seat now for 100 days. So what have you seen in the first 100 days?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I haven't been counting. I think I've passed 100 days, at least I hope so anyway. But I have learned it's a busy command is, I guess, how I would summarize. I think a lot of people think of STARCOM and they think training, and that's kind of where the thinking ends. But really, there's a whole lot going on beyond training. So obviously, we have Delta One, which manages our training and our sessions, and they assess about 2,000 Guardians per year. So that's busy in and of itself. And then we add on top of that our Delta 13, which does our education, our professional military education. Hundreds of Guardians go through these professional military education courses every year. And then as we broaden beyond training and education, our Delta 11 team runs our exercises, as well as running our range. They ran about 80 exercises over the course of the last year. And then our Delta 12 team does tests for the Space Force, about 100 tests per year that they execute, test events. And then not to be forgotten is also our Delta 10 team, who kind of ties it all together with some doctrine, as well as some concept development work and wargaming. So a whole lot of things that go on beyond training. As I've come into the command and tried to think about how we might group these, or what is really the mission of STARCOM, what's come down to in my mind is we develop combat credibility for the Space Force. And we do that through two activities: Guardian development and capability validation. So look forward to talking to you about those couple activities as we go throughout this interview.
I appreciate that, General. We're figuring out here as an organization is our job is to help tell the American public how critical the Space Force is. So what I'm curious from you is, how does STARCOM's mission align with the broader strategic goals of the United States Space Force?
Yeah, thanks, Bill, for that question. And I think you raise a really important point that we still have some education to do of the American public. I joke that sometimes my mom still asks me that question, and I had to define for her what we do as STARCOM and how we fit in as a Space Force. As you're well familiar with, the mission of the Space Force is to secure our nation's interest in, through, and to space. And as we look at how STARCOM's role of combat credibility fits into this, the way I like to think of this, ultimately, in order to execute that mission, we have to present forces to combatant commanders who can execute their warfighting mission. That's the role of the newly appointed Combat Forces Command. They take ready forces and they present them to combatant commanders. We also have Space Systems Command that delivers capability to some extent. But in order to have forces that linked with that SSC delivered capability, we need to have combat credible Guardians that understand combat credible systems and can deliver those. So Space Command takes the systems delivered by SSC. It takes Guardians that come in either through our recruiting and accession sources, and we turn them into combat credible Guardians linked with those systems, give them to Combat Forces Command, and they turn them into ready forces to present to combatant commanders. Ultimately, at the end of the day, though, the important thing is that we're able to secure our nation's interests, which are critical interests in the space domain.
Yes, sir. And you bring up the point about the criticality of the service and the support that you provide to ready the Guardians for their combatant command responsibilities and ensuring space superiority and freedom of action in the domain. So speaking of those, what are some of the key challenges STARCOM faces in preparing Guardians for future space operations?
Yeah, I think this ties exactly to that mission that we're talking about of the Space Force. And we think about why a Space Force was created. A Space Force was created, in my opinion, because we needed to create space-minded individuals that could operate in the domain. And so how is it that we go about as STARCOM in our mission of preparing combat credible Guardians to create space-minded guardians. We think about the sources of individuals. So on the officer side, um, people either go through officer training school or ROTC or through the Air Force Academy. Well, all three of those are Air Force managed activities, or we partner with the Air Force on those. On the enlisted side, we send our new enlistees to basic military training at Air Force basic military training. And then we send them through enlisted or initial skills training, also at Air Force schools for the most part. Keesler for our cyber operators, and Goodfellow for our intel operators. We do manage our own space operator development or initial skills training at Vandenberg. But so if you think about the goal was to develop space-minded individuals, but we're sending them through Air Force schools. Huge kudos to the Air Force for continuing to support us as we stood up a command and stood up a service. But as we migrate into the future, we really our goal is to have Space Force education for Guardians, taught by Guardians, that allows us to develop that space mindedness. So ultimately, I'd say that's our biggest challenge is how, as a new service, we can transition from relying on other service education to a service that does its own education and develops the space mindedness that's going to be critical for success.
Yeah, that's a great point, sir. And you're right. We all believe, and me running this organization, we are all about ensuring the Space Force has the resources it needs to do its job. So completely understand those challenges. Interestingly, in the draft FY26 NDAA, there's specific language that mentions and directs the new officer training course. Can you talk a little bit about why the Space Force changed officer initial skills training and what is the future of the courses as you move into its second year?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I mean, the real one of the reasons is what we just talked about. It's space mindedness. So
Yeah.
regardless of the accession source, whether it was ROTC, the academy, or officer training school, we needed to create a course where everybody could get baseline to a common level of space knowledge. And that also was independent of the career field they were going to go into, whether they're going to go be a space operator, cyber, intel, or even the acquisition workforce. Is critical that we have a common knowledge of what it means to operate in space and accomplish the mission of the Space Force. So that's one primary reason. A second reason is we look at the speed with which operations and warfight will develop in the space domain. We realize that we're not going to be able to stovepipe into specialties. We're not going to be able to hand the mission from an intel person to a cyber person to a space operator. Things are going to move at such speed that the officers, especially who are leading those activities, are going to need to have at least a common understanding and be able to operate in all three of those specialty areas, coupled with the fact that the rate of pace of change of our systems is going to happen at a rate we see in Ukraine with UAVs and other things that are. I think the refresh rate is on the order of weeks, and so we also need our operators, regardless of their domain, to understand some level of acquisitions and be able to integrate with our acquisition workforce in a fashion that they can operate at the pace and speed of need. And I think that's some of maybe what you're hearing from Congress and some of this direction that they're giving us. So those are the reasons why we stood up OTC. We just graduated our second cohort on the 31st of October on Halloween. And we got some great feedback from the first cohort and from the second cohort. And our goal, as we talk about and ask about moving into the second year, our goal is to take that feedback and continue to make the course better. So we're going to look at ways we can incorporate more acquisition and force modernization per congressional direction. And we're going to also look at ways we can incorporate a lot of feedback we heard from the first few classes, ultimately with the goal of developing and delivering the best combat credible Guardian officers to Combat Forces Command so they can turn them into ready combat elements.
Yes, sir. Thank you for that. It's interesting because I was at an event not too long ago with a young Guardian who had the opportunity to speak to a senior leader in the Space Force. And this young Guardian was saying, he's an acquisitions person. He says, hey, I want to be an operator. And the senior Space Force leader was saying, hey, in the future, it's not going to matter. Everybody's going to be a Guardian and you're going to be able to choose the path. And sir, it sounds like that's exactly what the Space Force is getting after right now.
Yeah, there's still some level of specialization, especially our enlisted workforce, who will be our tactical warfighters. But yes, the level of integration, we're so small, the mission's so tightly integrated across all those specialty areas. We've got to continue to move in the direction of further integration, and that's what OTC helps us get after.
Perfect, sir. And you bring up the point about enlisted forces. So let's talk about that for a moment. So what is STARCOM doing to focus on the enlisted training and education?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked about that. As I've come into the job, I've heard a few perceptions that we've ignored the enlisted force, and that's not at all the case. And an area in which we're also putting a lot of attention to make sure the guardians that we're developing in our enlisted corps, who are the tactical warfighters, as I mentioned earlier, are absolutely combat credible and prepared to execute the missions we're going to ask of them. So, really, kind of three areas we can talk about from enlisted training. First, basic military training. I talked a little bit earlier about how we're still relying on this Air Force to help us conduct basic military training. But one of the things we've done and that we're continuing to do is shift from an Air Force-centric curriculum to a Space Force-centric curriculum for those that go through Space Force training to become Guardians. So I think that will help tremendously as we continue to move in that direction. And then I also talked about initial skills training earlier, where we send to different Air Force schools, Air Force, to make sure we can shape that curriculum in a fashion that best supports Guardians. And we've also added a Space Force top-off for those that go through those schools. Longer term, I think it may make sense, and we're looking at what these options might be, uh, to consolidate or something similar to OTC, but not in the same vein, where we bring Space Force Guardians together to get enlisted training in a common fashion while still maintaining the specialties that they each execute, with the ultimate goal of creating a common baseline for all our enlisted. So that might look something like everybody goes through Guardian fundamentals, and then they go off and get specialty school training in some fashion, and then we bring them back together for a common exercise so they can execute those skills that they learned, whether cyber intel or space operations, in an integrated fashion in the way that they're going to have to do the mission. So those are some thoughts, still very premature as to what that might turn into, but some of the thoughts that we have about enlisted skills training. And then ultimately, or we also should talk about professional military education for our enlisted members. This is an area where I think we've made some great progress to date. Rather than sending our enlisted members to individual geographically separated places, we've created Vossler fellowships. Everybody goes through PME at Peterson, and I think that's made some good progress to kind of create that common foundation, as well as some space mindedness across our enlisted force. So, still a lot of work to do in the enlisted realm. We're really in all these training and education realms, but something that we're definitely put some attention to and want to make sure we get it right.
Yes, sir. That's great. You bring up all the work that you're doing for the officers, the enlisted. Not many folks realize that half of the service is made up of civilian guardians. So let's talk a little bit about what investments are being made for training and education for our civilian guardians.
Yeah, you hit on a really important point, and that I think the number I heard was a third, but roughly a third of our service are civilians, and they come from a number of different backgrounds, a number of different specialties. A lot of them are experts in what they do, and so the training that they need is maybe different than our new accessions or our basic military enlistees. But I think there's still a need to kind of baseline many of our civilians from a space-minded Space Force common understanding perspective. And so my predecessor, General Shaba, when he was in this job, he kicked off a pilot course for civilian guardian education. They did, I think, three pilots with about 2 weeks, 25 to 30 civilians in each course, and really positive feedback received from the civilians that went through the course as to the opportunity they had to learn more about the space domain, about the Space Force, and to be better prepared to execute whatever specialty we're going to ask them to execute in their various jobs in the various commands. So, building on that, we are working to formalize and finalize that, to find the budget and resources to be able to execute that on a more consistent basis, and hopefully get many of our civilian teammates through that course starting next year.
Oh, that sounds great, sir. Earlier you talked about the part of your mission is, of course, capability validation. Can you talk a little bit about that and what that really means?
Yeah. And this is a phrase we're using to capture a whole lot of things we do. We talked about the Guardian development, and that's pretty clear and easy to understand. I think there's more aspects of this or more nuances to this one. But even if you perfectly train and develop Guardians, unless they have kit that is relevant for the mission and domain that they're asked to execute, um, they're going to be relatively ineffective. And so the other part of this mission is we're trying to develop combat credible forces, is ensure there is combat credible kit to go with the combat credible guardians in order to execute the missions. So we don't build the kit or acquire the kit here in STARCOM. That, of course, is Space Systems Command and the other acquisition entities across the space community. But we are tasked with taking the kit that they develop and putting it into an operational environment and validating its ability to meet the missions that it's been given. And so we do that through range operations, through test, through exercises, through training events. But at the end of the day, the ultimate goal of this part of our mission is to ensure that the systems that are being developed can actually execute the mission in a operationally relevant environment, and that Combat Forces Command, as they're given those tasks from combatant commanders to execute those missions, can have confidence that those systems will meet the missions they've been tasked to do.
Yes, sir. It's funny because sounds exactly like something the CSO has spoken about in the past, which is we would never think to develop a combat system to any other service without a validated capability to train and exercise just like you would on the actual system. And so this is exactly what you're getting at is, yeah, we need to ensure that you have the capabilities that are just like the systems you're going to operate so that you can train on and exercise on. And that just needs to be part of the culture. So that sounds like a great vision.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of what we have to do here in STARCOM and a lot of where we're putting some attention and we're getting support from CSO to execute that mission as well, as you highlight.
Yeah, that's perfect, sir. And then that gets after, and I remember when the CSO was working with the Multi-Domain Command and Control Task Force when he was a one-star, working for the CSAF. And he talked about this tactics testing training cycle that needs to be ongoing. And it sounds like that's exactly what you guys are getting after. But let's talk a little bit about how the testing faster component makes sense and it ensures new systems coming online are combat credible.
Yeah, an important point earlier. We alluded to it with the fact that the turn time of new systems and system updates is not going to be, or it's going to be faster than probably we've seen in the past as we look at future war and future armed forces. And so, I think what we've done in the past a lot has been a serial approach of an acquisition entity develops it, we conduct developmental testing, hand over to an operational community to operational testing. Then we hand it over to additional parts of the operation community to develop tactics, techniques, and procedures. The serial approach doesn't work in the pace of change that we're seeing in the current and the future environment. And so what we've been tasked to do by CSO and we're working hard to get after is figure out how we can accelerate that cycle that you referenced. And really, the way we've come to accelerate that cycle is to avoid the serial approach and look more parallel or more integrated is probably the better term. And so we've created integrated test teams with acquirers, with operators from Combat Forces Command, with our testers, all integrated from the beginning of a program so that we can focus on continual test as opposed to thinking of test as a separate and distinct activity. That helps us to develop TTPs along the way. It helps us to also, as operators, then receive the system that's been validated and they have additional ideas for tactics and techniques that might work. Our testing community helps them in this continual test mindset to get after validating those tactics and techniques. So that allows us to go faster. The other thing that we're getting after in order to get after faster tests is you got to have test professionals. On this STARCOM community kind of has the lead on managing that test professional community. Our We have an officer test school and an enlisted test course out at Edwards, and the goal there is to develop some guardians that really understand and can be skilled in doing this test mission, which is a little bit different. Even though it's got to be integrated with everything else, it's got some different skill sets that are required. So, both in terms of looking at an integrated approach and developing some test specific and skilled guardians is how we're getting after a faster test.
Thank you for that, sir. Once an aggressor, always an aggressor. So I was a space aggressor back in the day. That was a long time ago, and I'm sure things have changed. And so, just from your perspective now, how are, first of all, what are aggressor squadrons? And, what do they do to help improve and build combat credibility?
Yeah, I did not know you were an aggressor, Bill. So you could maybe answer this question better than I. I have not been an aggressor, but I've learned a lot about them in the last few months, and they're a critical part of our efforts to ensure both our guardians and our systems are combat credible. The the way I like to think of it, I heard a description one time, the difference between an amateur or youth sports team and a professional sports team. When you're on a youth team, I remember back in the day, you go to practice and you're just practicing skills. There's no focus on the specific opponent that's coming up that weekend. You're just practicing how to dribble, how to pass, whatever the skill might be for your specific sport. Professional team, on the other hand, they have scout teams. They're watching the opponent and they tailor their practices. In fact, they have people stand in those practices to simulate what they might see when they go up against that real world opponent on that weekend. Our aggressors are essentially that real world opponent. So they get skilled in understanding red tactics, techniques, systems. And then in our exercises, in our training events, they play the role to help the role of the red team in order to help our guardians and our systems be validated against those capabilities. Not just a human role, they also have systems that allow them to create environments that may simulate the environment that warfighters might see real world. So they spend a lot of time going around and participating in different exercises. A great example, I think you're familiar with last summer, was Resolute Space out in the Indo-Pacific. Hundreds of Guardians went over, including a number of our aggressors, to do exactly what I just described, to help those that are participating in the exercise understand how our opponents in any future conflict may act.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. It's phenomenal to see how the mission has progressed. And you're spot on, General, when you talk about having a near peer competitor to increase your capability and work out some of those specific tactics, techniques, and procedures that you talked about. Now, a lot of times, and I'm dating myself, but back in the day, we used to talk about white carding events, and we would just throw out white cards to simulate an environment. And so now I know, General, I'm sure you're working towards a realistic training environment need. And so, what defines, in your opinion, a realistic training environment for Guardians, and how is STARCOM achieving that standard?
Yeah, Bill, we're still a lot of work to do here, but if I'm going to define the standard, I think back to when I was a lieutenant operating GPS satellites in two stops. And sometimes we would joke because we're just sitting there in front of a monitor, as you're familiar with space operations, and we would type things and the computer would have some response. So we would joke about how do we know this isn't just a big simulation and that something's actually happening on the other end.
Right.
To me, that's a realistic training environment. If I can have an operator sitting in a room and can't distinguish whether they're actually operating a real world system or they're executing a simulator to get reps and sets that are necessary. Obviously, we would inform them so they aren't doing something to the system that they don't intend to do. But from a philosophical standpoint, them not being able to distinguish between the two, that's where we have to get to from a realistic training environment. That requires a lot of work to do. It requires us having simulators that mirror our operational systems, and it requires an infrastructure to link all those together. And we're not there yet, but we're working with Space Systems Command and the OTTI team, as well as System Delta 81. in order to help build those capabilities that we need and really that Combat Forces Command needs in order to validate and train their operators.
That's a great segue, sir, because I'm sure a lot of people out there all interested in helping, from industry, academia, everyone is looking at opportunities to help the Space Force out. And you mentioned the big program that's out on the street, which is the OTTI program. And we just hosted, SFA was honored to host a industry day for System Delta 81 and the PEO in Colorado Springs to help try to define that. So if you could just talk a little bit about that relationship and how critical it was for Sys Delta 81 to stand up and the process by which you provide feedback and get feedback from SSC on programs like OTTI.
Yeah, so System Delta 81 may not be familiar to many listeners or people that might watch this podcast, but it was the OTTI Integrated Program Office. I think there was some confusion there because the operational test and training infrastructure is the deliverable, and at times it was shorthand with OTTI. Are we talking about the office or are we talking about the deliverable? So Systems Delta 81 now is the organization that will deliver for us as STARCOM the operational test and training infrastructure. Great partners. We work with them closely. They're not part of STARCOM. They're part of Space Systems Command, which makes a whole lot of sense in my mind as we work to normalize things across the Space Force. Just like Combat Forces Command is the operator of many systems that Space Systems Command delivers, STARCOM is the operator of the range and the test infrastructure that System Delta 81 will deliver. So as you mentioned, we work closely with them. The main process that we have, we're the requirements owner for the operational test and training infrastructure. So we work with entities across the Space Force and space community that might have requirements for a test and training infrastructure. We capture those, we prioritize those. We have a board of directors working with System Delta 81 where we then gain consensus on that prioritized list of requirements. And then Colonel Corey Klopstein and his team there at System Delta 81 work aggressively to deliver those capabilities for us and really appreciate the partnership we have with them.
That's a great explanation, sir. It's going to clear up, I think, a lot of questions about how that works together. And, there's a lot of deltas that are standing up, and so it's hard to keep up with the number of deltas. So again, providing that background is extremely beneficial. When you start talking about the critical capabilities that STARCOM needs to simulate that realistic threat environment during testing, just talk a little bit about just your vision for that.
Sure. And you can think about what capabilities you might need just by thinking about how you would do a test of a space system. But a critical part of what we're building is an on-orbit range. And so we need on-orbit capabilities that can simulate both red and blue space systems or capabilities. And then if you're going to execute operations in the space domain, you got to be able to watch those if you're trying to accomplish a test. So we need instrumentation that can allow us to see what happened during our test and to get real-time data and truth as it relates to the test activities. Then there may be some tests that we want to accomplish that we don't want to do on orbit or that we can't do on orbit. And so those, we need some high-fidelity simulators in order to execute testing in a simulated environment, but be very accurate. And so the team is working to develop some of those. And then we also, you may have heard of flat sats or some type of hardware in the loop kind of testing, where instead of simulating on orbit, we take hardware, put it somewhere on the ground, and we execute tests just to see how the parts of the satellite may operate together. Or that's kind of like a simulated version, but with some real world hardware in the loop. And so those are the main aspects of the space range that we're trying to build. We're also working to build an electronic warfare range, as that's a critical part of the Space Force mission set, as well as a cyber range, because that has tight integration to our activities as well. So similar aspects, live, virtual, and constructor, that we would build for those ranges. But those are really the three priority and primary efforts that we're working towards.
Perfect, sir. And just to add on to that, how important is having a digital twin to represent that in actuality, like having a no kidding high fidelity digital twin to represent that environment?
Yeah, absolutely critical. I mean, if you're going to do testing, and to be able to use that term accurately, you have to have a accurate model of your system in the digital environment. And so digital twin is that accurate model and becomes pretty important.
Perfect, sir. Again, SFA, we've got over 90 corporate members here in the organization, which really helps drive our mission set to support the United States Space Force. What kind of support does STARCOM need from our industry partners to realize the vision of OTTTI and other training testing initiatives?
Yeah, from a OTTI, the test and training infrastructure standpoint, we really need support for all those things we just talked about that we're trying to build. And Colonel Klopstein and his team are the ones that put out the request for proposals and are well engaged with our industry workforce in order to help us meet the requirements that we've given them. So, some great initiatives ongoing, but still looking for innovative ways to get after those requirements. We also know I met with a company recently that has some world-class space test facilities. So we're looking at ways we could maybe leverage existing facilities rather than recreate our own. And then, as you're well familiar with, the boom in commercial space and the investment in the space domain, I think gives some opportunity there for us to leverage some commercial investment and not have to do everything ourselves. Equally important, though, we often think of industry support to our capability validation mission. We could use, and we are leveraging industry on the Guardian development side as well. So building or recreating what other services have done to train their soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines isn't going to be adequate, or we just need to be different on the Guardian development side. And so we're looking for innovative ideas from industry, from universities as to how we can best train Guardians that can manage the pace of change and the types of challenges they're going to have, they're going to face in the future. And then before this, I was on the joint staff and found that often in the exercises that we do in the joint world, space is still white carded, as you mentioned, or not fully integrated. And so we've talked a lot in this podcast about developing those systems to help us train Guardians. I would also ask for industry help to figure out how we can integrate space and space effects into other domain models so that we can get the full joint impact that can help combat commanders moving forward.
Sir, congratulations on your command. Not many folks, or the folks who do know that your command is 2 years. So where do you want STARCOM to be when you hand over the guidon after this command tour?
Yeah, thanks. So a couple things there. One, the command can be as short as tomorrow, depending on how poorly I do in this interview or other activities. But 2 years is also way too soon or way too far in the future to be thinking about now. But I have thought about what I want to accomplish as I roll into the command, and I've really kind of focused on three areas that we've been talking about as a leadership team here in STARCOM. The first is we're trying to cultivate a collaborative culture, and what I mean by that is we're so small as a Space Force, we can't have stovepipes, we can't have people trying to defend their turf. We just got to all be collaborating towards the same ultimate goal of success for the service. And so we're really trying hard to generate a kind of a yes-if mindset here in the command, that we can all work together and get the mission done. So that's kind of the foundational layer. And then you're probably familiar, we recently moved our headquarters down to Florida, but I still have a good chunk of my team in Colorado. There's still, just if you looked out my window here in Florida, there's some temporary buildings that are being constructed for the team to move into. So the second focus area is what I'm calling bolstering our baseline, but it's really getting all those activities kind of just laid flat, so that the next commander doesn't have to worry about things like where his team's going to sit, his or her team's going to sit, or those kind of things. So, I mean, as you're familiar, STARCOM was the only field com that started from scratch. SSC grew out of Space and Missile Systems Command, and Combat Forces Command grew out of everything that was in Building 1 to include Headquarters Air Force Space Command. So we have a bit of a challenge of establishing that baseline, but I would like to move as far as I can down that baseline in the next 2 years. And then the third one is ultimately just creating that combat credibility that we've spent this interview talking about, trying to align everything we're doing towards that common mission of generating combat credible forces that we can hand to Combat Forces Command, who can then turn those combat credible forces into combat ready forces who are trained on a specific mission system with a specific mission set, who can be successful in accomplishing combat commander missions, but ultimately in defending our nation. So those are really the three kind of areas that I'm focused on for as many minutes or days or months as I have left in the seat.
That's a great overview, sir, and definitely a phenomenal vision. Again, General Smith, thanks so much for taking time. Congratulations on your command. Really appreciate you taking time with your SFA today, and just want to looking forward to seeing you here at Spacepower Conference in the very near future. And have a great Space Force day, sir. Semper Supra.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Semper Super. I look forward to seeing you here in Orlando in just a few short weeks.
Great. Thank you, sir.
Eyes on the stars, boots in the fight. Forging space, power blazing light. No fear, no retreat, we persevere. At the Space Power Conference, we make it clear.